I stood in the driveway of my own home, staring at the glossy sold sign hammered into the earth. My sister hadn't just stolen the only place I felt safe. She had sold my sanctuary for $890,000. But Samantha's perfect crime was about to unravel in the most spectacular way. The property sat at the end of a winding, dirt-packed road in Blue Ridge, Georgia. Grandpa Henry had built the cabin with his own two hands back in 1982, dropping the white pines, stripping the bark, and laying the foundation stone by stone. It wasn't just a house. It was a living, breathing monument to our family's history. When he passed away 3 years ago, the silence he left behind was deafening. I moved into the cabin full-time shortly after, maintaining the property, fixing the rotting fascia boards, and running a small custom woodworking business out of the detached barn. My older sister, Samantha, lived a very different life in Atlanta. Married to a real estate broker whose ambition vastly outweighed his talent, she was accustomed to leased luxury cars, country club dues, and a perpetual state of financial panic masked by designer clothes. We rarely spoke. When we did, the conversations inevitably circled back to money, specifically, how much she needed, and how unfair it was that I got to live rent-free in the woods. I always assumed the cabin belonged to both of us, left in a murky state of shared inheritance that we would eventually sort out. I was dangerously naive. It was a brisk Tuesday in late October. I had been in town picking up a load of raw cherry wood for a client's dining table. As my rusted Ford F-150 crested the final hill leading to my driveway, I hit the brakes so hard the lumber in the back slammed against the cab. A heavy-duty steel chain was wrapped around the entrance gate, secured with a massive brass padlock I had never seen before. Just beyond the gate, parked on the gravel I had meticulously raked 2 days prior, was a sleek black Range Rover. A man in a tailored charcoal suit was walking the perimeter of my porch, pointing at the roofline while a contractor took notes on a clipboard. And there, planted aggressively next to the mailbox, was a wooden sign, "Sold, Peachtree Luxury Real Estate." My heart slammed against my ribs. I threw the truck into park, hopped out, and vaulted over the wooden fence. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, my boots crunching loudly on the gravel. The man in the suit turned, unbothered. He had the slick, polished look of a corporate developer. "Can I help you, buddy? This is private property." "I know it's private property," I snapped, gesturing wildly at the cabin. "It's my property. Who are you and who put that sign up?" The man let out a patronizing sigh and pulled a business card from his breast pocket. "Richard Sterling, Sterling Hospitality Group. And I think you're mistaken. We closed on this parcel at 9 a.m. this morning. The seller's agent assured me the property was vacant, save for some junk in the barn that we're having hauled away tomorrow." "Seller? What seller?" My voice was trembling. I felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "Samantha Hayes," Richard replied smoothly. "Now, I suggest you leave before I call the county sheriff for trespassing." I didn't argue with him. I couldn't. The air had been completely sucked out of my lungs. I stumbled back to my truck, my hands shaking so violently I dropped my keys to know twice before getting the door open. I locked myself inside and dialed Samantha's number. She picked up on the third ring. The background noise sounded like a busy restaurant. "David," she answered, her tone clipped and completely devoid of warmth. "I figured you'd be calling around now." "Sam, what did you do?" I choked out, staring through the windshield at the stranger inspecting my home. "There is a man here saying you sold Grandpa's cabin." "I did," she said, taking a sip of something. I could hear the ice clinking against the glass. "It closed this morning, $890,000. David, cash buyer." It was an offer I literally couldn't refuse. "You can't sell it! It's half mine! I live here!" I was screaming now, slapping the steering wheel. "Actually, David, you don't. And it isn't." Her voice dropped an octave, dripping with a condescending authority that made my blood boil. "Grandpa signed a quitclaim deed, transferring the property solely to me 3 weeks before he died. You've been squatting there for 3 years. Greg's business is under, David. We were going to lose our house. I needed the liquidity, and frankly, it's time you got a real job and moved out of the woods. You have until Friday to get your tools out of the barn." Click. The line went dead. I sat there in the cab of my truck, completely paralyzed. The smell of the cherry wood in the back suddenly made me nauseous. My sister hadn't just evicted me, she had sold our grandfather's legacy out from under me to save her own failing facade of a lifestyle, and according to her, the law was entirely on her side. The next 5 days were a blur of utter humiliation, with the county sheriff standing by to ensure I didn't vandalize the buyer's property. I hastily packed my life into rented storage units. I moved onto the lumpy futon in my friend Tom's basement in the next town over, feeling like a ghost. I tried to fight it. I spent the last of my savings on a brief consultation with a local real estate attorney, but when he pulled the county records, the wind was completely taken out of my sails. There it was, scanned in stark black and white on the county clerk's database. A quitclaim deed, dated just 21 days before Grandpa Henry's fatal stroke. It legally transferred the deed of the property from Henry Miller to Samantha Hayes. The signature was shaky, frail, exactly how Grandpa's handwriting looked at the end, but it was definitely his. It was notarized, stamped, and legally recorded. "I'm sorry, David," the lawyer had said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Unless you can prove your grandfather was not of sound mind when he signed this, which is incredibly difficult to do 3 years after the fact, your sister is the sole legal owner. She had every right to sell." I was utterly defeated. Samantha had walked away with nearly $1 million, and I had lost my home, my business location, and my connection to the only man who had ever truly cared for me. But exactly 2 weeks after the eviction, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, assuming it was a debt collector. "Hello?" I muttered. "Is this David Miller?" The voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely strictly business. "Speaking. My name is Gregory Finch. I'm a senior title investigator for Piedmont Title and Escrow. We handled the title insurance policy for Richard Sterling, the gentleman who purchased the property on Whispering Pines Road." My jaw tightened. "Look, man, I'm out of the cabin. You guys won. What else do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Miller. I want to buy you a cup of coffee," Gregory said, "because I'm not supposed to be making this call, but my conscience won't let it go. There is a massive problem with the transaction that just took place, and I think your sister has committed a felony." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a corner booth at a local diner, watching a man in a rumpled trench coat slide into the seat across from me. Gregory Finch looked like a tired detective. He had dark circles under his eyes and carried a thick, battered leather briefcase. He didn't bother with small talk. He popped the latches on his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, dropping it onto the formica table between us. "Title investigators are essentially historians, David," Gregory began, pulling out a pair of reading glasses. "Our job is to trace the history of a property's ownership to ensure there are no liens, no hidden heirs, and no defects in the title before we ensure the transaction. Your sister's file came across my desk a month ago. On the surface, it looked clean. The quitclaim deed was recorded. The taxes were paid. But—" I leaned forward, my heart beating in my throat. "I have a habit of looking closer at quitclaim deeds executed just weeks before a property owner's death," Gregory said softly. "They are notorious breeding grounds for elder abuse and fraud. So, I started digging into the notary who stamped the document." He slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a printout from the Georgia Secretary of State's website. "The notary who stamped your grandfather's quitclaim deed was a man named William Barrett," Gregory explained, tapping the paper with his pen. "Take a look at the date his notary commission expired." I squinted at the text. "Commission expiration date, September 12th. Now," Gregory said, sliding the copy of the quitclaim deed next to it. "Look at the date the deed was executed, September 14th. My eyes widened. The notary's license was expired when he stamped the deed? "By 2 days, Gregory nodded. "In Georgia, that technically invalidates the notarization. Now, usually, that's just a clerical error, a sloppy mistake, but it gave me a legal foothold to pause the escrow file and dig into the county archives. I went down into the basement of the courthouse, looking for anything else attached to your grandfather's name. And that, David, is where I found the ghost." "The ghost?" Gregory reached into his folder and pulled out a completely different document. It was thick, bound with a blue legal cover, and looked ancient. He pushed it across the table. "The Henry Miller Revocable Living Trust established. April 14, 2010. Your grandfather didn't just own the property outright when he supposedly signed that quitclaim deed," Gregory said, his voice dropping to a whisper. 16 years ago, he transferred the deed of the cabin into this living trust. When a property is owned by a trust, the individual person cannot sign it away with a simple quitclaim deed. It has to be transferred by the trustees, acting in accordance with the trust's bylaws. I stared at the document, my mind spinning. I don't understand. If this trust existed, how did Samantha sell the cabin? Because your grandfather's estate lawyer passed away years ago, and the county clerk misfiled the original transfer document back in 2010. It was buried. Samantha clearly found the quitclaim deed in your grandfather's belongings, or forced him to sign it, completely unaware that the property was legally locked inside a trust. So, the sale to Richard Sterling is void? I asked, a spark of hope finally igniting in my chest. Worse than that for your sister, Gregory smiled grimly. When she signed the closing documents with my escrow company, she signed a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury, stating she was the sole, unencumbered owner of the property. She then accepted a wire transfer of $890,000 across state lines. That is federal wire fraud. But here is the real twist, David. Gregory flipped the trust document open to the third page, pointing to a highlighted section. When a living trust is established, it names beneficiaries and trustees who take over upon the grantor's death. You are named as a beneficiary. Samantha is named as a beneficiary, but the bylaws explicitly state that the property cannot be sold, mortgaged, or transferred without the unanimous, notarized consent of 3 acting trustees. I frowned, looking up at him. 3? It's just me and Samantha. Who is the third? Gregory leaned back in the vinyl booth, a strange look crossing his face. That's what took me an extra week to figure out. And David, you are not going to believe who your grandfather left holding the keys to your family's kingdom. I stared at Gregory Finch, the rumble of the diner fading into background static. Who is the third trustee? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. Who did Grandpa Henry trust more than his own flesh and blood? Gregory took a slow sip of his black coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. Beatrice Gallagher. The name hit me like a physical blow. Beatrice Gallagher wasn't a lawyer or a wealth manager. She was the fiercely independent, sharp-tongued woman who owned the local hardware store in Blue Ridge. She had known my grandfather since the 1970s. They had played chess every Sunday on her front porch for 2 decades. More importantly, Beatrice was the one person in town who had never been charmed by my sister, Samantha. Beatrice had always seen right through the designer clothes and the fake smiles. Samantha despised her, frequently referring to her as that old busybody. Beatrice, I breathed, running a hand through my hair. Grandpa made Beatrice the gatekeeper, and a formidable one, from what I can gather. Gregory nodded, closing the thick manila folder. Here is the reality of your situation. Piedmont Title and Escrow insured this transaction for Richard Sterling. That means if the title is defective, which it is, because Samantha never had the legal right to sell a property held in a trust, my company is on the hook for $890,000. Sterling will sue us, and we will have to make him whole. So, what happens now? I asked, the sheer magnitude of the money making my stomach churn. Now, the title company becomes the victim of fraud, Gregory explained, his tone shifting from sympathetic to purely clinical. But to trigger the insurance claim and freeze the escrow funds before Samantha and her husband funnel them into offshore accounts or use them to pay off their massive debts, I need the rightful trustees to formally contest the sale. I need you and Beatrice Gallagher to step forward. I didn't waste another second. I left cash on the table, thanked Gregory, and drove straight to Beatrice's property on the outskirts of town. Her house was a beautiful, rambling Victorian with a wraparound porch, meticulously maintained. As I pulled up, I saw a young woman on the porch swing, sifting through a stack of mail. She had warm, intelligent eyes, and dark hair pulled back in a messy clip. I recognized her immediately, though it had been years. It was Amelia, Beatrice's granddaughter. She had moved back to Georgia a year ago after finishing a paralegal degree in Chicago. Well, look what the cat dragged in, Amelia said, setting the mail aside. Her smile was cautious but genuine. I heard what happened with the cabin. I am so sorry. Grandma has been pacing a hole in the floorboards since she found out. She knows? I asked, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. Of course she knows. It's a small town, Amelia replied, opening the heavy oak front door. Come on in. She's in the study. We've been expecting you. The study smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and the faint, comforting aroma of pipe tobacco that Grandpa Henry used to smoke. Beatrice was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk. At 72, she possessed an intimidating posture and a gaze that could cut glass. "Sit down," Beatrice commanded, pointing to a leather armchair. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find out you were robbed." "I just spoke to a title investigator," I started, but Beatrice held up a hand, silencing me. She unlocked the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a familiar blue-bound document, the original Henry Trust. "Your grandfather was a very observant man," Beatrice said, her voice softening just a fraction. "When Samantha married Greg, Henry saw the writing on the wall. He saw a man who leveraged debt to look rich, and a granddaughter who was perfectly willing to play along. Henry knew that the moment he died, Samantha would try to liquidate the cabin to feed Greg's failing real estate ventures." Amelia walked into the room carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea, setting it down between us. Our hands brushed briefly as I took a cup, and I felt a sudden, unexpected spark of warmth in an otherwise freezing week. She gave me an encouraging nod and sat on the arm of the sofa, a yellow legal pad in her lap. "So, Grandpa created the trust to protect the cabin," I said, putting the pieces together. "He made me the 3rd trustee to break the inevitable tie between you and your sister," Beatrice confirmed. "The bylaws require unanimous consent to sell. He knew I would never consent to selling that land to a developer. It was supposed to be your home, but when he passed, the original estate lawyer had died, and the county misplaced the filing. I assumed Samantha was just biding her time. I had no idea she had fabricated a quitclaim deed until I saw the sold sign." Amelia clicked her pen. "Grandma and I have been doing some digging of our own since the sign went up. I pulled the public records on Samantha's husband's brokerage." Amelia looked at me, her expression dead serious. "They are drowning. Greg's firm is facing 3 separate lawsuits for defaulting on commercial loans. They were days away from bankruptcy. That $890,000 wasn't just a payday. It was a desperate lifeline to keep them out of federal court. But she committed wire fraud to get it," I said. "And the notary stamp on the quitclaim deed was expired." Amelia's eyes lit up with a sharp predatory intellect that I found incredibly captivating. "Oh, it's much worse than an expired stamp," she said, leaning forward. "I tracked down William Barrett, the notary whose name is on that deed. He lost his commission because he moved into an assisted living facility in Florida 4 years ago due to severe dementia. He hasn't stamped a document in half a decade." The room went dead silent. "Samantha didn't just get lucky with a sloppy notary," Beatrice said, her voice cold as ice. "She, or Greg, ordered a replica stamp online and forged the signature. They premeditated the entire thing." I felt the last remaining thread of familial loyalty snap. My sister hadn't just made a selfish decision in a moment of panic. She had orchestrated a calculated, criminal conspiracy to steal our inheritance and defraud a buyer, leaving me homeless in the process. "What do we do?" I asked, looking between Beatrice and Amelia. For the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a weapon. "We dropped the hammer," Amelia said smoothly, tearing the top sheet off her legal pad. "I've already drafted the affidavit of contested title. Grandma has signed it. You sign it next. Tomorrow morning, we walk into the finest real estate litigation firm in Atlanta, and we blow Samantha's perfect life to pieces." The offices of Bradley, Vance, and Associates, though I exclusively dealt with Jonathan Bradley, a senior partner, were located on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. Jonathan Bradley was a man who looked like he had never lost an argument in his life. He wore a bespoke navy suit, had a razor-sharp jawline, and possessed a terrifyingly calm demeanor. Amelia had been instrumental in securing the meeting. Over the past 3 days, we had practically lived together in Beatrice's study, surrounded by empty coffee cups and stacks of county tax records. Working alongside Amelia had been the only thing keeping me sane. Her brilliant mind, her quiet empathy when the betrayal felt too heavy, and the late-night conversations we shared over takeout had sparked a deep, undeniable connection between us. In the midst of the ugliest chapter of my life, she was a sudden, brilliant light. Bradley reviewed the file Amelia had meticulously prepared. He looked at the forged quitclaim deed, the original trust documents, and the affidavit from the title investigator, Gregory Finch. "This is remarkably brazen," Bradley said, steepling his fingers. Your sister and brother-in-law haven't just stepped over the line, they've sprinted past it into federal jurisdiction. Here is how we play this to ensure maximum leverage and minimum collateral damage to you. Bradley outlined a strategy of total legal warfare. First, Piedmont Title and Escrow would file an emergency injunction in federal court, freezing the $890,000 sitting in Samantha and Greg's joint accounts. Second, Richard Sterling, the furious buyer who had already begun renovations on a property he didn't legally own, would file a massive civil suit for fraudulent inducement. And finally, Bradley smiled, a dangerous glint in his eye. We invite them to a mediation session. We don't tell them we know about the forgery or the frozen funds. We let them walk in thinking they have the upper hand. Then, we dismantle them. The trap was set for a rainy Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after I had been evicted from my own home. The conference room at Bradley's firm was intimidating, a long expanse of polished mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray Atlanta skyline, and high-backed leather chairs. I sat on one side with Jonathan Bradley. Amelia sat directly behind me, a silent pillar of support. I could feel the subtle, reassuring pressure of her hand resting briefly on the back of my chair. At precisely 10 a.m., the heavy glass doors swung open. Samantha and Greg walked in. They looked like a walking advertisement for new money. Samantha carried a handbag that cost more than my first truck, her hair perfectly blown out, a look of bored irritation plastered across her face. Greg wore a flashy pinstripe suit and a gold watch that caught the overhead lights. He reeked of expensive cologne and unearned arrogance. "Let's make this quick," Greg said, not bothering to shake hands as he pulled out a chair for Samantha. "We have a lunch reservation at Capitol Grill. I assume you're here to beg for a cut of the sale? We are willing to offer a nuisance settlement of $10,000 if you sign a non-disclosure and walk away." Samantha didn't even look at me. She busied herself checking her phone. "Take the 10 grand, she muttered. "It's more than you deserve for living off Grandpa's charity for 3 years. I felt my blood pressure spike, but before I could speak, Jonathan Bradley cleared his throat. "We aren't here to discuss a nuisance settlement, Mr. Hayes," Bradley said smoothly, opening his leather portfolio. "We are here to discuss the Henry Revocable Living Trust, established 16 years ago, which expressly forbids the sale of the Blue Ridge property without the signatures of all 3 named trustees." Greg froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. Samantha finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing. "What trust?" she snapped. "There is no trust. I have a legally binding quitclaim deed signed by Henry himself. The sale is done. The money is in our account." "Actually, Mrs. Hayes, the money was in your account," Bradley corrected, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "As of 8 a.m. this morning, your accounts at Chase Bank have been frozen by a federal judge under suspicion of wire fraud." Samantha went pale. The color drained from her face so fast she looked ill. "Frozen? You can't do that. That's my money." "It is stolen money," Bradley countered, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet register. He slid a second piece of paper across the table. "This is an affidavit from the title investigator, and this is a sworn statement from Amelia Gallagher, representing Beatrice Gallagher, the 3rd trustee. You sold a property you did not own." "It's a clerical error," Greg shouted, slamming his fist on the table. He was sweating now, his eyes darting frantically. "We had the deed. The notary stamped it. It's completely legal." That was the moment I had been waiting for. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany. I looked my sister dead in the eyes. "The notary, William Barrett, lives in a memory care facility in Boca Raton." "Sam," I said quietly. The room was so silent I could hear the rain hitting the glass outside. "He's had advanced dementia for 4 years. His commission expired 2 days before the date on that deed." "Where did you buy the fake stamp, Greg? Was it Amazon, or did you find a specialty counterfeiter online?" The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a house of cards completely and utterly collapsing. Samantha looked at Greg, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. "Greg?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is he talking about? You said you handled the paperwork. You said a guy at your office notarized it." Greg opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a cornered animal. In that split second, the reality of their marriage was laid bare. He had forged the document to save his failing business, and he had used his wife's inheritance as the vehicle to do it. But Samantha was the one who had signed the closing documents. She had perjured herself. "You set me up?" Samantha shrieked, suddenly pushing her chair back and pointing a trembling finger at her husband. "You told me it was legal. You told me Grandpa signed it before he died." "He did sign it," Greg lied, his voice cracking. I had to recreate the stamp because the original was smudged. It's a technicality." Jonathan Bradley didn't miss a beat. "Recreating a state notary seal is a Class C felony, Mr. Hayes. Perjury on a federal closing document is another. Wire fraud across state lines is a third. Right now, Richard Sterling is filing a lawsuit against you for fraudulent inducement, demanding his $890,000 back, plus damages. The title company is preparing to hand their investigative file over to the FBI." Samantha put her head in her hands and began to sob. It wasn't the manipulative crying I had seen her use growing up. It was the ugly, desperate weeping of someone who had just realized their entire life was over. "What do you want?" Greg asked, his voice entirely defeated. He slumped in his chair, staring at the polished wood table. Bradley closed his portfolio with a sharp snap. "We demand the immediate, undisputed return of the $890,000 to the title company to unwind the sale," Bradley stated. "We demand a signed confession regarding the forgery of the quitclaim deed, which will be held in escrow. You will formally renounce any and all claims to the Henry Trust. In exchange, my client will not press criminal charges for the forgery. However, we cannot control what the federal prosecutors decide to do regarding the wire fraud." They had no choice. They were trapped, outmaneuvered, and facing years in federal prison. The arrogance that had fueled them for years evaporated in a matter of minutes. As we walked out of the conference room, leaving my sister and her husband to face the wreckage of their own greed, I felt a profound sense of closure. The cabin was safe. Grandpa's legacy was secure. Amelia walked beside me as we headed toward the elevators. She reached out and slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were warm, and her grip was steady. "You held up incredibly well in there," she said softly, looking up at me with a smile that made my chest tighten. "Grandpa Henry would be proud." "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted, squeezing her hand. And for the first time since I saw that sold sign in my driveway, I realized that losing the cabin for those 3 agonizing weeks might have been the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to fight for my home, and in doing so, it brought me to the person I wanted to share it with. The fallout from that morning in the conference room was swift, brutal, and entirely public. When you build a life on a foundation of deceit, the collapse doesn't happen quietly. It brings down everything in its vicinity. Within 48 hours, the federal injunction holding the $890,000 became permanent. Piedmont Title and Escrow successfully clawed back the wired funds, reversing the transaction and leaving Richard Sterling with a massive, vacant hole in his real estate portfolio. Sterling was not a man who took losing lightly. He immediately unleashed a torrent of civil litigation against Greg's brokerage, citing fraudulent inducement and breach of contract. The pressure of the impending lawsuits and the looming federal investigation acted like acid on Samantha and Greg's marriage. The illusion of their unified, wealthy front dissolved into a vicious, finger-pointing war. Greg, desperate to avoid federal prison for the forged notary stamp, tried to strike a plea deal by throwing his wife entirely under the bus. He told prosecutors that Samantha had forced him to find the counterfeit stamp online, claiming she was the mastermind who exploited their grandfather's fading health. But Samantha, backed into a corner and facing the absolute destruction of her social standing, retaliated with a cold, calculated fury. She handed over years of Greg's private financial records, exposing a massive web of commingled client funds and illegal offshore accounts he had been using to keep his brokerage afloat. She even provided the time-stamped emails where Greg had coordinated the purchase of the fake Florida notary seal. They destroyed each other. Greg's firm was raided and subsequently liquidated. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and forgery, facing a mandatory minimum sentence. Samantha, while avoiding the heaviest of the forgery charges thanks to her cooperation against Greg, was still charged with perjury for signing the federal closing documents. The country club memberships, the leased luxury SUVs, and the sprawling Atlanta estate were all seized or sold to pay off a mountain of legal fees and restitution. She was left with nothing but a suspended sentence, mandated community service, and a tarnished name that would never recover in the city she prized so much. While their world burned to the ground, mine was quietly being restored. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon in late November when the legal dust finally settled. The county clerk had officially voided the fraudulent quitclaim deed and correctly recorded the Henry Revocable Living Trust. The title was clear. The property was safe. I drove my battered Ford F-150 up the winding dirt road in Blue Ridge, my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. As I rounded the final bend, the cabin came into view. The heavy steel chain was gone. The brass padlock was nowhere to be seen. Standing by the mailbox, holding a heavy iron crowbar, was Amelia. She wore a thick flannel jacket and a pair of faded jeans, her dark hair catching the autumn sunlight. Next to her, already ripped from the ground and splintered into 3 pieces, was the sold sign. I parked the truck and stepped out, the crunch of the gravel under my boots sounding like a homecoming. "I took the liberty of doing a little landscaping," Amelia said, a brilliant, warm smile spreading across her face as she tossed the crowbar into the bed of my truck. "I hope you don't mind. It's the best landscaping this place has ever seen," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. We walked up the wooden steps of the porch together. I pulled the familiar, worn brass key from my pocket, the one I thought I would never use again, and slid it into the front door. The lock clicked, and the door swung open, revealing the dusty, quiet sanctuary of my grandfather's home. The smell of aged pine and wood smoke washed over me, a sensory embrace that told me the nightmare was finally over. Over the next few months, life took on a rhythm that felt deeply authentic. I pulled my tools out of the rented storage units and fired up the table saw in the barn. My custom woodworking business didn't just survive, it thrived. Word had quietly spread through town about what had happened, and the local community rallied around me. Orders for custom dining tables, cabinetry, and carved mantels flooded in faster than I could process them. Beatrice Gallagher remained the formidable, sharp-tongued third trustee, occasionally stopping by the cabin to inspect my work and demand a game of chess on the porch. We never spoke of Samantha, but there was a quiet, mutual understanding between us. The gatekeeper had done exactly what Grandpa Henry knew she would do. But the most profound change was Amelia. What had started in the high-stakes pressure cooker of a legal battle blossomed into something beautiful and deeply rooted. We spent our evenings sanding down old cherry wood in the shop, sharing takeout on the porch, and talking until the stars faded into the dawn. She possessed a fierce intellect and a compassionate heart, completely devoid of the superficial pretense that had poisoned my sister. One evening in early spring, as a light rain pattered against the tin roof of the cabin, Amelia and I were sitting by the stone fireplace. The fire cast a warm, flickering glow across the room. I looked around at the solid, hand-hewn logs my grandfather had laid, and then I looked at the incredible woman resting her head against my shoulder. The contrast between the life my sister had chased and the life I had fought to keep had never been starker. Samantha had wanted the polished veneer of success, willing to commit fraud to maintain a hollow image. I just wanted the truth, the wood under my hands, and the people who actually mattered. The hard karma that had caught up to Samantha was a tragedy of her own making, but the peace I found in the aftermath was a hard-won victory. The rusted iron padlock sits on my desk today, a heavy reminder of the price of greed. Samantha traded our family's legacy for an illusion of wealth, losing her freedom in the process. I kept the cabin, the timber, and the truth. With Amelia by my side, we aren't just preserving my grandfather's history, we are building our own, grounded in the unshakable foundation of an honest and enduring love.